There are performers who teach by talking about what they do. And there are performers who never explain anything, who believe that the knowledge lives in the body, in the stage, in the specific physical experience of having stood under a light in front of 10,000 people and discovered, through that experience alone, what you were capable of. James Brown was the second kind. James Brown did not give advice. The people who worked with him, toured with him, played behind him for decades, they all said the same thing about him when it came to other performers. James Brown did not offer counsel. He did not sit younger artists down and tell them what he thought they needed to know. He had built everything he was from scratch in the hardest possible way, and he did not romanticize that process by turning it into lessons. The knowledge was in the work, and the work was what you watched. If you were paying attention, you learned. If you were not paying attention, that was your problem. So when James Brown spoke to Michael Jackson backstage before a major television performance in the early 1980s, when he pulled him aside in the corridor, away from the handlers and the crew and the other performers waiting their turn, it was not something he did for everyone. It was not a habit. It was a specific decision, made quickly, by a man who almost never made this kind of decision. The broadcast was one of the large television events that punctuated the American pop year in the early 1980s. The kind of special that gathered the prominent names of the moment and packaged them into a 2-hour production that the networks still treated as genuine events. The backstage areas on these productions were particular environments, crowded with too many people, organized with too little time, full of performers who were either anxious or performing relaxation, and threaded through with the specific energy of a live broadcast getting close to air. James Brown arrived the way James Brown always arrived, with the full presence of a man who had been commanding rooms since before most of the people in this building were born. He was 50 years old. He had been the hardest working man in show business for 30 of those years. He had created the vocabulary of funk and soul from the inside, had invented moves, invented rhythms, invented a relationship between a performer and a stage that had influenced every popular genre that came after him. He did not carry his history with him in any ostentatious way. He did not need to. It arrived when he did. Michael Jackson had grown up watching James Brown, not as a casual viewer, as a student, in the specific way that a child who is already performing watches the person who is doing what they want to do, except better and harder, and with a completeness that feels, from the outside, like a force of nature. Michael had studied the footwork, the command, the way James Brown moved across a stage as if the stage had been built specifically for him and for no other purpose. He had imitated it, the way children imitate what they love, fully and without irony, in living rooms and church halls and talent shows before he was 10 years old. The debt was real. Michael had never denied it. What he did not know in the early 1980s was what that kind of knowledge felt like from the inside. He understood James Brown the way a musician understands a recording, the sounds, the shapes, the architecture. He did not yet understand it the way James Brown understood it, from the body, from 40 years of standing on every kind of stage in America and learning, through the specific education of repetition and failure and recovery, what a performer could do and could not do, and what happened in the space between. Michael was 23 or 24 years old. He had been performing since he was 5. He had sold more records than anyone in the building. He had nothing on paper to learn from backstage advice. He was, by every metric the industry used, already arrived. That was exactly why James Brown said what he said. James Brown told Michael something about the floor. Not the floor as a metaphor, the actual floor, the stage floor, the space beneath a performer's feet, the physical reality that the audience never thinks about, but that a dancer or a performer understands as the foundation of everything. He told Michael that the floor was a relationship, not a surface. That the most important thing that happened in a performance was what happened between the performer's feet and the floor. The weight, the resistance, the way you could feel the stage respond to your movement before the audience could see it. That performing was a conversation you were having with the floor before you had it with the crowd. This was not abstract for James Brown. He had spent 40 years developing a relationship with every kind of stage floor that existed. Wood, concrete, linoleum, the rubber of outdoor stages, the specific give of floors that had been worn down by previous performers. He could tell, within seconds of stepping onto a stage, what that floor was going to give him and what it was going to take back. He had learned this not from anyone who told him, but from 40 years of letting the floor teach him. He was telling Michael something that could not be written down or demonstrated in rehearsal. He was telling him something that could only be transmitted in the specific language of performer to performer, standing in a corridor backstage at a television broadcast 20 minutes before the cameras went live. Michael was in the corridor when James Brown found him. He had finished his technical check and was standing with two people from his team, reviewing something in a small notebook, the way he reviewed things before performances, quietly, internally, with the specific focus of someone who had learned very young that the minute before the stage was not the time for conversation. James Brown stopped. He looked at Michael for a moment. Then he dismissed, with a brief gesture that required no explanation, the two people standing near Michael, and they understood and stepped away. What happened in the next few minutes was witnessed by several people at a distance and reconstructed from what James Brown occasionally said in subsequent years, not in formal interviews, not in books, but in the specific way he sometimes mentioned things while talking about something else, the parenthetical observation that reveals more than the direct statement. He was not a man who talked about private conversations. He talked about the work. But this conversation was, in the specific sense he understood, about the work. Michael nodded once when James Brown finished. Not the polite nod of a younger performer thanking an older one for their time. The different nod. The one that people who knew Michael recognized as the acknowledgement of something that had landed somewhere real. James Brown held his gaze for a moment. Then he said one more thing, very quietly, that nobody standing at a distance could hear. Then he walked toward the stage. Michael stood in the corridor for a moment after James Brown left. Then he put the notebook in his jacket pocket and stood straight and walked toward the stage himself. The performance Michael Jackson gave that night was described by people who watched it from the wings as different from his previous appearances on the same type of broadcast. Not in any way they could quantify or describe precisely. Not a new move, not a different arrangement, not a longer or shorter set. Something in the quality of the presence. Something about the way he occupied the floor. One of the musicians in the band that night, a guitarist who had played on several Michael Jackson sessions, described it afterward as the first time he had watched Michael perform and felt that Michael was not performing for the audience, but with them. That the performance had the quality of something being given rather than displayed. He did not know what had happened in the corridor. He did not know that James Brown had been there. He was describing what he saw from the stage. He was describing the specific quality of a performance that had changed in some way that was not visible in the choreography or the arrangement or anything the cameras caught between the technical check that afternoon and the live broadcast that evening. Something had shifted. He did not have language for what. Michael listened the way he listened when something was important. Completely. Not politely, not with the performance of attention that younger performers sometimes gave to older ones out of respect for the name attached to the advice. He listened with the specific quality that people who had worked with him recognized as his actual attention. Still, absorptive, present in a way that did not announce itself. James Brown said something else, something about the audience, not how to read them or how to manage them or how to respond to them when the energy in the room shifted, but something more fundamental than any of those things. Something about what they were there for. They were there, he said, for something they could not get anywhere else. Not the songs, not the choreography, not the production. They were there for the specific thing that happened when a performer who knew what they were doing stood in front of people who needed something and gave it to them without flinching. That transaction, a performer giving something unrepeatable to people who had driven 50 miles to receive it, was the thing. Everything else was architecture. James Brown had spent 30 years performing that transaction at an almost inhuman level of consistency. He had done it sick, done it injured, done it the night after his son died, done it through the personal and professional difficulties that had broken performers who were less committed to the obligation. He understood the transaction from the inside in a way that very few people in the history of American popular music had understood it. The education James Brown had was not available in any other form. It could not be taught in a class. It could not be found in books about performance or interviews with performers. It existed only inside the specific experience of having done it, having stood in front of audiences who needed something, in venues that were not always welcoming, at moments that were not always comfortable, and having given the thing anyway, completely, without reservation, for 40 years. The people who had received that education could recognize each other. They could also recognize someone who was very close to it, but had not yet fully arrived. He was standing in a corridor in the early 1980s, 20 minutes before a live broadcast, telling Michael Jackson something about it. James Brown did not talk about this evening in terms that singled it out. He spoke about Michael, in the years that followed, with the specific respect he reserved for performers who understood what a stage was for, who had not confused the mechanics of performing with the thing itself. He said, on more than one occasion, that Michael understood the floor. He did not explain what he meant. He did not need to. The people who knew James Brown understood that this was the highest thing he knew how to say about a dancer. Michael Jackson performed for millions of people over the years that followed, in arenas, in stadiums, in television broadcasts that reached audience numbers that restructured what the word broadcast meant. The performances that people who saw them live remember most vividly are rarely the most technically complex or the most elaborately staged. They are, almost without exception, the ones where Michael seemed to be doing something that was not choreography, where the floor was a relationship and the crowd was a conversation, and the performance was a transaction between a performer and his audience that felt unrepeatable because it was. James Brown knew what that felt like. He spent 30 years knowing it from the inside. He stood in a corridor for a few minutes and gave Michael Jackson the only version of it that could be transmitted directly, performer to performer, without the floor between them. 20 minutes later, both of them walked out toward the same stage, one of them with 50 years of that knowledge, one of them still building toward it, and both of them carrying something that the cameras could not quite capture, but that the people watching from close enough could feel in the room. The cameras were live, the floor was real, and whatever James Brown had said in that corridor was already part of what happened next.